Well, thank you for joining. I must admit it does feel a little bit strange to be presenting to no audience by pre-recording, but I hope you'll bear with me. I'm very grateful for you taking the time to watch this lecture and to learn a little bit more about the impact of abortion on women. It's obviously the common position and the common knowledge to assume that abortion has been liberating for women, that it's been a good thing that has helped women on the whole. But actually, I want to suggest that there are a number of different ways in which the legalization of abortion throughout the 20th century in different countries has led to very deleterious effects on women and has actually plausibly contributed to significant unhappiness among women, even though some women in individual cases might well have felt like abortion has been helpful for them or has made their lives happier. I want to suggest that on the whole, abortion has been bad for women, and in particular, it's had a particularly bad impact on the most vulnerable women in society. And I'm going to be giving a few different arguments for that point. Part of this, of course, is about justice. The whole question of abortion is a question of justice. And part of the reason pro-lifers think that abortion is not good for women is, of course, because it puts them into a situation where justice is not done. And let me explain that a little bit. Desmond Tutu, one of the great people in South Africa who had a huge role in ending apartheid and in the reconciliation movement after apartheid, said this about our humanity. He said, "My humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in theirs. We are diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed, or treated as if they were less than who they are. What dehumanizes you inexorably dehumanizes me." And what he's saying there is that dehumanization isn't just something that affects the victims of dehumanization. Dehumanization affects everybody. Justice means treating people equally and treating them with dignity. And it also means restoration of relationship. And so this means that when unborn children are harmed through abortion, their families and societies are worse off. And I'm going to be arguing in particular, their mothers are worse off. Abortion is not a solution for anyone, and it doesn't have to be a balance between the woman's rights and the child's rights. Actually, the pro-life position says both of them matter infinitely, and the best outcome is one that treasures both of them and restores that relationship and repairs the things in society which push women towards feeling like they have to break that relationship and end their pregnancy. The pro-life position is that both lives matter deeply and that women deserve better than abortion. Compassion is centrally important in this debate, and part of the reason for that is just that abortion is so common. In the UK, 1 in 3 women will have an abortion in their lifetime, and that equates to about 200,000 a year. In Sweden, the abortion rate is significantly higher still. In pro-life countries, by contrast, the number is significantly lower, but it's still significant. Abortion is everywhere, and hence compassion is of utmost importance in responding to people who have been through abortion or who have encouraged abortion or who've been in any way implicated in abortion. We need to be gracious and understanding and compassionate because abortion, as I said, is something that doesn't just harm the child. It has ripple effects throughout all of society. One of the first ways we can see that is not so much a problem in Europe, though it is an increasing problem in Europe, but is a massive problem globally. And this is the problem of sex-selective abortion, which has increased hugely since the 1980s, since ultrasounds became widely available. It's now thought that there are 1.6 to 1.7 million baby girls who were aborted every year simply because they are girls. That's not to say anything about all the other baby girls aborted for different reasons. This is just sex-selective abortion. Nearly 2 million girls are lost each year simply on the grounds that they are girls. This mainly happening in India and to a large extent China as well. This, of course, is something that's been widely condemned among pro-choice people. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe strongly condemns the practice of prenatal sex selection, i.e. abortion, and it calls on member states to introduce legislation with a view to prohibiting sex selection in the context of legal abortion. And yet, of course, this phenomenon, which is a human rights abuse and which is discrimination, is still legal across most of Europe. In fact, in the UK, it's very much legal because all that needs to be done is for someone to say that having a baby girl would affect their mental health, and that would fulfill the legal requirements for obtaining an abortion. Now, it was found a few years ago that early gender tests, i.e. the ability to find out the gender of a baby in the womb even earlier than before, was leading to the selective abortions of girls in the UK. And in response to this, one of our major political parties was absolutely outraged and called for a ban on the use of this screening test for sex-selective abortions. But this is incredibly strange because there was an opportunity for a ban in Parliament just a couple of years earlier. There was a vote in Parliament on banning the misuse of screening for sex-selective abortions, and the overwhelming majority of those party members voted against that ban, and hence sex-selective abortion still remains legal and practiced in the UK. This doesn't just affect those girls, and it doesn't just affect society's general view of women, and it doesn't just reflect society's general view of women. When it happens on a large scale, as it has done in India and China, it leads to enormous downstream effects, including particularly on sex trafficking. Because of the lack of women in many parts of Indian society and in many regions within India, this has led to a huge demand for sex trafficking, essentially sex slavery, and has led to enormous human rights abuses all across India and in many, many ways that come downstream of the initial decision to have a sex-selective abortion. And this will have knock-on effects throughout the entire world as well. The second way in which abortion has been bad for women is through the prevalence of coercion and coercive abortion. While it's fair to say that the majority of abortions are not overtly the result of coercion, nevertheless, most abortions are the result of soft pressure, a woman feeling like she has to end her pregnancy because there's some other circumstance in her life which makes it untenable. And a very significant minority of women are outrightly coerced, whether through employment pressure or through their partners or through their parents, or sometimes even through abortion providers and doctors. In one study, up to 64% of women felt pressured, and over half of them felt they needed more time to make the decision. According to the pro-choice Guttmacher Institute, about a quarter of women say that one of their reasons for having an abortion was that their partner did not want the pregnancy. A Norwegian study from 15 years ago said that a quarter of women said that pressure from the male partner was a major reason in having an abortion. And of those quarter of women having abortions, the average response was to say that there was a great deal of pressure, not just a small amount of pressure, and that this was a really significant part of the reason for having an abortion. A study from Sweden just 10 years ago showed that Swedish teenagers in particular face overwhelmingly negative attitudes about continuing a pregnancy. The paper was even called An Illusion of Power, talking about how, although in theory, teenagers in Sweden have the choice whether to abort a pregnancy or keep a pregnancy, in fact, there is so much pressure from family, from the male partner, and from others in society that in effect, it's not a real choice. And Swedish teenagers who want to keep their baby are faced with an impossibility. Society does not make it possible for them. And as I said, when you take away outright coercion, a huge number of women are forced into abortion by soft pressures, not outright insistence or pressure or threats or intimidation, but the pressures of circumstances in society making it untenable in a woman's mind to continue with a pregnancy. So for example, 3/4 of pregnant women and new mothers in Scotland claimed that they faced pregnancy and maternity discrimination. This obviously is a kind of pressure which may well lead many women to abort, especially given the prevalence of abortion for career reasons, seen particularly in Northern Europe. I said that we also see this sort of pressure from abortion providers and doctors themselves, and here are some examples. Marie Stopes International is a very well-known abortion provider, both in the UK and across the world. I should now say it's MSI Reproductive Choices. They decided to change their name because Marie Stopes was a well-known eugenicist. So they've made it into an acronym now, rather than spelling the name out in full. They were not investigated, but simply observed by the Care Quality Commission, who are the main hospital regulators in the United Kingdom. Anyone who works in healthcare in the United Kingdom knows that when the Care Quality Commission are around, you put your best behavior on. So this is a kind of a picture of a fairly typical abortion clinic on its best behavior for when the inspectors come round. And it showed some quite horrific results, in fact. Staff actually expressed concern that they were paid based on their performance for key performance indicators, and that these key performance indicators included women having an abortion or not proceeding with an abortion. And the point was that they were paid more if a woman went through with an abortion compared to if the woman did not have an abortion. And they explicitly said this focus on achieving these indicators worked against the concept of patient choice. The report revealed that they had a target number of women going through with abortions of 98 to 100%. The target wasn't for women to make an informed decision by herself. It wasn't for her to make a free decision or a free choice. The target was for every woman, or almost every single woman, to go ahead with an abortion, no matter how ambivalent or uneasy she might feel about it. And in particular, it drew attention to the risks of coercion towards children. It didn't talk about outright coercion, but it did say that consent was routinely accepted from children without proper assessment of their ability to understand the risks. What this means is that consent was routinely taken from children that was not informed. And again, as anyone who works in healthcare will know, a lack of informed consent is not consent at all. So these were children who routinely were having abortions without valid consent. Sometimes we get even more obvious outright coercion from doctors. This is something which has been widely condemned among the international community, including people who are generally very supportive of abortion. The Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the UN talked about discrimination against disabled people, and they say discrimination against disabled people includes brutal forms such as forced and coerced abortion. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe likewise said that the practice of forced abortions is to be criminalized. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities went even so far as to say that forced abortion on disabled women was a form of torture and violated the UN Convention Against Torture. And there have been many, many condemnations of forced abortion, of course, since. But while we typically associate forced abortion with countries with appalling human rights records in the past or in the present day, in fact, in some respects, Western countries are no better. This kind of human rights abuse, or I think we could legitimately call it torture, occurs in the United Kingdom. There was a case just a year or two ago of a disabled lady who had a mild to moderate learning disability. She could express her wishes, she was perfectly communicative, she could have desires and so on. This wasn't someone who was in a coma or in some other really exceptional condition. This was a woman with mild to moderate learning disabilities. She was an adult in her 20s, and she was 22 weeks pregnant, meaning that the baby had a chance of surviving outside of the womb. She was that far along in the pregnancy. Well, the doctors decided that because she was disabled, she shouldn't have the baby. And although she said that she wanted the baby, although her mother, who was a Catholic midwife, said that she would look after the baby, and although the social worker, who most likely was pro-choice given the UK context, the social worker said that the family were able to look after a baby, the doctors felt otherwise. And so the doctors demanded that she have an abortion. Now, of course, she protested and the family protested and said, we don't want an abortion. So the doctors took the family to court to force her to have an abortion. And in the court, the judge said all the evidence indicated that the woman wanted to keep the baby, but she ruled that an abortion should still be carried out. And the news reports also said to try and appease the woman who didn't want to have an abortion, doctors told her that she would be given a new doll to play with instead of the baby after having the abortion. This is something that sounds like something from, who knows, frankly. This is something that we expect from the most appalling countries in terms of human rights records. And yet this is something that happens in the UK at the decision of doctors and with the imprimatur of the legal system. Now, fortunately, in this case, at the very last minute on the day that the abortion was scheduled, the family received funding to appeal the judgment, and a higher court overturned the judgment. But if they hadn't received the funding, this would have gone ahead. And we know that in other cases with similar backgrounds, these sorts of things have happened. So this does happen in the UK. Abortion is often justified on grounds of mental health. And in fact, in the UK, this is the justification for 98% of abortions, because we don't officially have abortion on demand. It all has to be some sort of health reason. But 98% of them in the UK are for mental health reasons. And of course, many abortion advocates will say that abortion is needed to preserve the psychological well-being of women. And that's generally the main reason people give for abortion. Well, what's interesting about this is that there is no evidence for this whatsoever. David Ferguson was the world's leading authority on abortion and mental health. Everyone from across the spectrum agreed that his research was the best research in the world on this topic. He himself was pro-choice. He thought pro-lifers were a nuisance and they were annoying, but he was honest about his research. And he said he was surprised to find that there was no credible scientific evidence demonstrating that abortion has mental health benefits. He was even more surprised to find that there was actually significant evidence that abortion caused mental health problems. There was a 28% increased risk of anxiety, a 70% increased risk of suicidal behavior, and even higher increased risks of alcohol and drug misuse. Now, this is something that's extremely important. And the normal response will be to say that these studies don't take into account a woman's previous mental health or the fact that it's an unwanted pregnancy and so on. But actually, Ferguson's research took all of that into account. He took into account the previous mental health, the socioeconomic status of the woman, previous other problems, demographic factors, and so on. And he found that even when you take all of this into account, including the fact that the pregnancy was unwanted, still women who had abortions had significantly higher rates of mental disorder than women who continued unwanted pregnancies to term. And this was been shown through a meta-analysis that he did later, taking results from many different studies and showing that all the best evidence supports this conclusion, not just from his own studies. Now, this has an important impact on mortality. I'm not going to talk about maternal mortality in general terms in this lecture. I'm not going to talk about the impact of abortion legislation on maternal mortality. The reason is not because I want to avoid it, but because I have far too much material on it. If you'd like me to give another talk sometime on the impact of abortion legislation on maternal mortality, I'd be more than happy to do so. But in general, the trend we see is that abortion legislation has virtually no impact or no consistent impact on the number of women who die from illegal abortions. This is particularly the case in Sweden, which research showed back in the 60s and 70s that the legalization of abortion in the 30s and then the further liberalization in the second half of the 20th century did not lead to any decrease in maternal mortality whatsoever. This is the usual pattern. Sometimes there is a different pattern. In some countries, maternal mortality increases when abortion is legalized, such as in the Netherlands or in Rwanda or in Ethiopia. But in Sweden, it seem to make no difference whatsoever. And that's the usual pattern for most countries. I won't continue further on that point, but as I say, there is much, much more that could be said about it. But one of the reasons mortality, and particularly maternal mortality, isn't improved by legalizing abortion is the fact that abortion is associated with significantly increased mortality compared to continuing a pregnancy. Now, many people will say the exact opposite, that pregnancy is much, much more dangerous than abortion. And there is a sense in which pregnancy does have some physical risks to a woman that are not there if a woman ends the pregnancy. But this results from a very simplistic understanding of mortality and an inconsistent way of measuring the maternal deaths. For example, when you count maternal deaths, i.e. deaths after a pregnancy, suicides are usually included. And this gives a very, very large number for the number of women dying after a pregnancy, because suicide is a very common thing after pregnancy. But suicides are not included in abortion statistics. And this is very significant because the suicide rate after abortion is much, much higher than the suicide rate after pregnancy. So many of these claims come from an inconsistent way of dealing with the relevant statistics. In fact, maternal suicide is the second largest cause of direct maternal deaths within 6 weeks of the pregnancy. And if you go up to a year after the end of a pregnancy, it's the leading cause of direct maternal deaths in most developed countries. But as I said, the suicide rate after abortion is many, many times higher than the suicide rate after delivering a baby. Here's just an example of that from Finland. In Finland, you can see there was a suicide rate for women who were pregnant and continue the pregnancy, which is pretty low. And in fact, it's lower than average. And there are well-known reasons for this, namely that pregnancy is one of the strongest protective factors against suicide, and childbirth and child rearing are also very strong protective factors. By contrast, if a woman ends the pregnancy through abortion, that suicide rate goes back up not just to the average rate, but several times higher. And in fact, the suicide rate is 6 to 7 times higher after abortion compared with continuing a pregnancy. This leads to a discrepancy in the mortality rate because suicide is the leading cause of maternal death within a year of pregnancy. The mortality rate for this, mainly for this reason, is triple after having an abortion compared with continuing a pregnancy. And this discrepancy is only becoming larger. Pregnancy is becoming significantly safer over time. So from the late 80s to the early 2000s, there was a 27% decrease in the mortality rate from pregnancy. But by contrast, abortion is not becoming much safer. In the same time period, there was only a 10% decrease in the mortality from abortion. So while pregnancy gets safer and safer, abortion doesn't seem to get significantly safer. And this trend we see over time and may be expected to continue. As I said, pregnancy and child rearing are two of the strongest protective factors against suicide. And so there's a very simple and obvious causal mechanism for this discrepancy. One of the other ways abortion has been harmful for women and harmful for later children is that abortion is associated with a significantly increased risk of preterm birth. Now, I should say here that there are lots of different risks associated with abortion. Some of them are very widely conceded and are direct complications from the procedure, like perforation of the uterus, hemorrhage, infection, and so on. Some of the long-term links are far more disputed. So for example, abortion's link with breast cancer is vehemently denied by many people within the field. That's a subject which I have not looked into in sufficient detail to be able to comment. And I want to make it clear that everything I talk about is something that I'm very confident of and have looked into in great detail. And this is one of those things, and this is fairly uncontroversial. Pretty much everyone is agreed in the field that abortion is associated with an increased risk of preterm birth. This increased risk is about 30% for one abortion and is 50 to 90% for more than one abortion. And it seems to increase the more abortions a woman has. It's worth saying here that having more than one abortion is now in fact the norm. Most women who have an abortion will go on to have another abortion at some point in their life, at least in Northern Europe. When it comes to very early preterm births, so we're talking about births before, say, 32 weeks, the increased risk is higher still. And this is significant because very early preterm births are a significantly worse outcome that have significantly more risks for the child. And of course, a much, much bigger burden on the mother who has to deal with the complications of the preterm birth. Though many authorities deny that this link is causal, it's worth noting that the only real explanation the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists give for this link is cervical trauma, meaning the trauma that the cervix of a woman undergoes during an abortion. So the only explanation given by the Royal College is a causal connection between the abortion and later preterm births, even though the Royal College seems to deny that connection, or at least says there's insufficient evidence for it at this moment. Well, it seems likely that there is this connection and that it is causal. And this connection is very significant. In the USA, it's responsible for about 23,000 very early preterm births each year. And those in turn lead to about 2,000 excess cases of cerebral palsy. A kind of cost analysis performed in 2007 suggested that even when you just look at the initial neonatal costs of preterm birth arising from abortion, these costs amount to about $1.2 billion a year. And that's excluding all of the costs associated with long-term medical conditions arising from preterm births. And for those who are not very familiar with preterm births and the complications that can arise from them, they are very significant globally. The WHO estimates that preterm birth complications are the leading cause of death for children under the age of 5 around the world. And they account for about 1 million deaths of children each year. A further way that abortion has been harmful for women is through its impact on sexually transmitted diseases. Now, no one is suggesting here that abortion very directly increases your risk of sexually transmitted disease. There's no kind of physiological mechanism there that we're aware of. What I mean here is that the legalization of abortion and the liberalization of abortion are associated with significantly changed sexual behavior, and in particular, an increase in risky sex. The reason is that if people know that they can always have an abortion in case of pregnancy, they are more likely to take risks by having sex with new people, having unprotected sex, and so on. And for that reason, abortion legalization is associated and has been shown to be associated empirically with an increase in transmission of sexually transmitted diseases. Jonathan Click has done the most work on this, and he's used gonorrhea transmission as a kind of proxy or an indicator of the increase in STDs arising from abortion legalization. He suggests that the increase is really quite significant. It's about a 60% increase in sexually transmitted diseases arising from the legalization of abortion. Now, these complications have significantly more impact on women because they can cause things that men don't have, such as pelvic inflammatory disease, ectopic pregnancies, miscarriage, and premature labor. Men, of course, can suffer infertility as a result of sexually transmitted diseases, but the bulk of the complications of sexually transmitted diseases falls on women. And that's just for gonorrhea alone. When it comes to the other sexually transmitted diseases, of course, there can be much more serious consequences. In fact, it's been estimated that up to $4 billion is spent each year in the US just on treating STDs which are attributable to abortion legalization. That is to say, when abortion was legalized in the US, sexually transmitted diseases were increased so much that they now cost an extra $4 billion a year to treat. And of course, some of these are much more serious, particularly HIV and AIDS, which has not only an enormous financial cost, but of course has the tragic cost of many lost lives, including in the US and in Northern and Western Europe, but obviously especially in many parts of the developing world. Finally, then, I want to talk about how abortion affects the sexual culture and what effect this has had on women. And this is the point where it becomes a little bit more controversial. The main reason being that people don't like to talk about sexual culture, sexual behavior, and the impact of legislation on those things. But it's pretty much uncontroversial within the economics literature that changes to abortion legislation and policy have a big impact on how people behave, and how people behave when it comes to sex and relationships has an enormous impact on society as a whole. When it's put that way, everything is uncontroversial and it's pretty clear. But we'll see that when we look at the specific evidence, the impact that abortion legalization has is overwhelmingly negative when it comes to building up societies and building structures that support women and support families, and particularly support women in difficult positions. So the way that this works is that abortion access increases uncommitted sex or risky sex. The increase in risky sex leads to the breakdown of the family on the one hand, because it encourages people to have sex with multiple partners, causes addictions and so on, and leads to a much higher divorce rate and family breakup rate, as we've observed quite clearly in Europe in the last 50 or 60 years. Uncommitted sex also leads to far more unwanted pregnancies. And this means that women overwhelmingly are left with the burdens of unwanted pregnancies, whether the burdens of having an unwanted pregnancy and carrying that child to term and looking after the child, or placing it for adoption, which can be very distressing for a woman, or the woman is burdened with the downsides of abortion, which are pretty uncontroversial. Abortion is a distressing event that is associated with significantly worse mental health outcomes. And this is something that women are overwhelmingly burdened by, in contrast to men. And so, of course, both of these effects have a disproportionate impact on women, and in particular, they have a disproportionate impact on poor women, the women who are the most vulnerable and who are already at the bottom of society, being trodden on by the powerful and privileged people in society. They have been overwhelmingly worse off as a result of this sexual culture facilitated by abortion access. Let me just give some evidence for that. This evidence comes from a surprising source, you might think. George Akerlof is a Nobel Nobel Economics Prize winning economist. His wife actually is his co-author, Janet Yellen, and Janet Yellen is now President Biden's Secretary of the Treasury. So these are not people who are particularly conservative. These are not kind of pro-family Christian fanatics or anything. I don't know their religious beliefs, but they're certainly not associated with the political right or with social conservatism. But nevertheless, they noticed in the 1990s that the legalization of abortion did seem to be associated with very significant increases in certain trends in family breakdown, and that this had a huge impact on women and on poverty. They wrote that over the last 25 years, disturbing trends have occurred in the US and other Western countries. Just at the time, about 1970, that the permanent cure to poverty seemed to be on the horizon. And just at the time that women had obtained the tools to control the number and the timing of their children, single motherhood and the feminization of poverty began their long and steady rise. As a result, the United States poverty rates have been stubbornly constant for the last quarter century. What they're saying is that in 1970, it looked like poverty was towards being eliminated. But actually something changed around that time that meant single motherhood had a huge rise, poverty had a huge rise, and in particular, women in poverty had a huge spike. And this they attribute to the increase in contraception and abortion availability in the late 1960s and early 1970s. As I said, this has a significant impact on family breakdown. I don't think this can be disputed at all. I don't think anyone would dispute it. It's very clear all around us that family breakdown is much, much more common now than it was before abortion was legalized. But family breakdown, as much as some people try to deny the empirical evidence, is associated with a variety of negative outcomes, both for the parents and for the children. Now, this is something that some people will attribute to pre-existing factors, but again, it's clear that even when you take into account those pre-existing factors, family breakdown is associated with poor outcomes for the parents and for the children, whether in increase in suicide rates for the mother and the father and for the children, or through an increase in criminal activity among the children and so on. The person who's done the best work on this is Professor Sarah McClanahan at Princeton University, who has written a paper in 2013 on the causal effects of father absence, arguing that it's the father absence specifically, men being away from their children, even if they're in contact, the simple fact of a father being away from their child in the home is associated with a diverse range of negative outcomes for those children. It's been shown, particularly by the work of Lerman, that the decline in marriage is associated with a significant increase in child poverty and inequality. So it's not just the fact that children in general are worse off, but the children who are already the most disadvantaged are even further disadvantaged by the decline in marriage and the increase in family breakdown. George Akerlof, that Nobel Economics Prize winning economist, wrote another paper 2 years later, talking about the fact that the changes in sexual behavior facilitated by abortion and contraception led to what he called an extended adolescence of men. What he meant is that because men no longer had as much of an incentive to settle down with women whom they had made pregnant, men decided that they could spend many, many more years not really doing anything with their lives and not taking responsibility as they would have done in earlier times. And he said this was linked with an extremely large increase in all sorts of pathologies for which men are primarily responsible, including violent crime. And of course, with the current talk all over the world about male violence and the impact that male violence has on women in particular, it's very easy to see how this sort of extended adolescence of men and the unwillingness of men to take responsibility for their lives and for their actions has had a significantly detrimental impact on women overall. Of course, the sexual culture more generally reflects the preferences of men much more commonly. Men have double the number of sexual partners that women do. Women far more often regret casual sexual encounters than men do, and they far more often wish that they had waited before having sex. Women express more negative views on cohabitation and on abortion, in fact, than men do. But as I said earlier, most centrally, women suffer the burdens of single parenthood, abortion, and unwanted pregnancy disproportionately. These all increase massively as a result of increased access to abortion. But men don't have to suffer those burdens to any significant extent. Men can simply pick up his bag and walk away. It's women who are left to pick up the pieces from unwanted pregnancies. And these unwanted pregnancies are facilitated by a permissive abortion culture. Of course, this kind of change in the sexual market where there's much less of a sense of responsibility and much less of a sense of commitment is possibly also related to the significant increase in mental health problems that we are seeing in Western and Northern Europe and in the Western world more generally. When you think about mental health problems, particularly such as eating disorders, it's very easy to see how there is a connection between eating disorders and the sexual market and sexual behavior, and the fact that in an environment where men are incentivized to have sex with lots of different people and to have many different relationships, there is a much easier link that you can draw between this kind of consumerist sexual environment and sexual market and certain mental health conditions, which again, younger women are much more vulnerable to and which are much more prevalent among younger women. And perhaps for all of these reasons, although it's often claimed that women have been liberated since the 1970s through the sexual revolution, in fact, the objective evidence shows very little sign of this. And there are many studies which suggest that women's happiness has declined since the 1970s, and it's even declined relative to men. And so this gives just a little bit of empirical evidence suggesting that no matter how much women are told that they have been liberated by abortion, the objective empirical evidence on women's happiness shows no empirical sign of this liberation. Finally, I said earlier that these sorts of societal changes have a much bigger impact on the people at the very bottom of society, the most disadvantaged people. All of these things that arise from abortion legalization, whether mental illness, whether divorce, family breakdown, abortion, unwanted pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, and so on, all of these have a bigger impact on the poor. And this can be seen just through some very simple statistics, but obviously there's much more that's been written about it. In the UK, in the top socioeconomic group, 75% of children have married parents. But in the lowest socioeconomic group, only 35% of children have married parents. That means that in the lowest socioeconomic group, children are much more burdened by the facts of family breakdown and the consequences of family breakdown. So when we hear all of the elite people talking about sexual liberation and the fact that divorce is absolutely fine, about the fact that family breakdown and family structure really doesn't make a difference to society, that is coming from a very privileged perspective where the top socioeconomic group on the whole, does not suffer the downsides of family breakdown. The downsides of family breakdown are felt particularly amongst the lowest socioeconomic groups, whose voices are simply not heard in society. And it's been estimated, for example, that if the US returned to the marriage rates of 1970, child poverty would be 20% lower. In fact, it's been argued that the decline in marriage has been responsible for over half the increase in child inequality in the US since the 1970s, and the entire increase in child poverty. That is to say, the expected trajectory from the 1970s is that child poverty would decrease. But as a result of the decline in marriage, not only has child poverty not decreased, it's actually increased by a significant amount. And this is attributable to the decline in marriage, which, as I said, is attributable in turn to abortion legislation. David Brooks at The Atlantic puts it this way: the market wants us to live alone. And there's been a huge amount written about how the consumerist market and capitalist oligarchs want people to live alone because they spend more, they have less responsibilities, they invest less in their family and more in material goods and so on, and they're less committed. They can basically be swayed by advertising and so on. The capitalist oligarchs want us to live alone. But of course, the clearest predictor of a person's well-being is relationship. This is pretty uncontroversial. There's been a huge study from the Harvard University looking at the things that most predict happiness. And by far and away, the obvious answer is that relationship predicts happiness. And it's precisely relationships which have been so damaged by the sexual culture facilitated by legalization of abortion. And so, of course, it goes without saying that this decline in well-being and this decline in relationship is something that significantly impacts women and on women's happiness, and is another reason, adding to the long list of reasons why abortion is something that hasn't, on the whole, served women well. Thank you so much for listening to this talk. I'm aware that some of it may well have been very obvious, but some of it may well have been extremely challenging. That was the point, and I always hope to stimulate and provoke genuine, thoughtful, and well academically established and empirically based dialogue. So please, if you do have any questions, please do get in touch. I'd love to hear challenges, responses, thoughts, and questions, and I'd love to try my best to answer those. I don't want to be the kind of person who presents this sort of evidence and expects no pushback and expects no challenge. On the contrary, I think the evidence very clearly shows the fact that abortion has been detrimental to women's well-being. But I want to be open-minded about that. I want to be critical and thoughtful about that. And so if you disagree, please do get in touch, and I'd be more than happy to try and defend my position as best as I can and show you the wealth of evidence that underlies all of this research. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a brilliant rest of your day.